Okay, hi everyone, welcome to the quarterfinals of Austro-Asians Inter-School Debating Championship. First of all, I would like to congratulations for making it to quarterfinals. Um, so on today's debate on OG, we have AISB Green, on O we have Cream and Polish, CG is GMA2, and on CO we have Sri KDU White Break. So before we start, I would like to have all of the debaters to introduce themselves, your preferred gender pronoun, and also preferred method of POI. So we will start with OG.
Hi, my name is Shreyas. I'll be the Prime Minister today, and my preferred personal pronouns are he, him.
All right, thank you. Can we have DPM?
Yes, hello, my name is Moore. I use he, him pronouns, and I will be the DPM for today's debate.
All right, cool, thank you. Let's proceed with OO.
Hello, I'm Justin Chang, and I'm okay with like any male pronouns, any of that. And our sub POIs in the chat. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Now Diallo.
Hello, my name is Arthur. I'll be DLO. I also use male pronouns. For POIs, please do so in the chat.
All right, thank you. Member of GUF.
Hello, my name is Riya Sharma, and my pronouns are she/her.
All right, thank you. GUF Whip.
Hello, my name is Sachit. My preferred pronouns are he/him.
All right, thank you. Member of OP.
Hello, my name is Izu, and I do not have a preferred gender pronoun.
All right, thank you. And lastly, OP Whip.
Hi, my name is Ira, and I don't have a preferred gender pronoun.
All right, cool. All right. Now let's have the panels to introduce themselves.
Hello, hi, my name is Ernest. Here, there, fine, thank you.
Hi, I'm Carlo, one of the panelists. Preferred pronouns are he, they. Good luck.
All right. Hi, my name is Amy. Preferred gender pronoun she, her. I think with that, we can start the debate, debating the motion. This House believes that the re-implementation of the Iran deal with its original terms unchanged will bring more harm than good. With that, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to begin speech. Here.
Thank you. I'd like all my POIs raised verbal, please. And I will just set up my timer. Okay, I will start in 3, 2, 1. Honorable panel, esteemed debaters, welcome to this side of the House. As the Prime Minister, I will make a variety of points and show why this motion must stand. I will start off by defining the key terms in this motion before proceeding to my own framing. Once my framing is established, I will delve into my substantive arguments before finally coming to a model and a conclusion. So without further ado, let us start by defining the motion. So the motion states that the House believes that the re-implementation of the Iran deal, with its original terms being unchanged, will bring more harm than good. So we'd like to define re-implementation as bringing back the original and starting anew. And we're going to define more harm than good, than the drawbacks of it exceeding the benefits of it. Now moving on to my framing. Lifting sanctions could be detrimental to the United States of America, and Iran could very easily hide their nuclear weapons and cheat their ways through it, as they have previously done. So I'd like to move on to my first subset of people, the view of people, and how the United States of America is such a great power at the moment. The United States jumping in and out of agreements and changing their views could be detrimental to global views. The US is seen as a great power by nations all over the world. They step in and try to resolve conflicts diplomatically before, of course, and use force if necessary. They are a respectful nation, and they are a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and therefore a big voice in the biggest decisions that are made all over the world. However, if the US keeps jumping in and out of agreements, they're painting a bad picture of themselves. Yes, President Obama decided to take part in this deal, and he did it dutifully, and he finished what he started. That is good. However, President Trump decided that it was not in the USA's best interest to stay in this deal. We've got to completely respect that. He's the president of one of the biggest nations in the world, therefore has a great knowledge, he has great staff to assist him. So he knows what he's doing. He probably had multiple clear and definite reasons for why he chose to leave this deal. Therefore, they've chosen their own path. The United States have chosen their own paths to move forward. And nations all over the world respect that, as they're such a prominent nation. So why should everyone respect that? Because as I said, US is a strong power. But also, why should the US not jump back into this deal? Well, by deciding to re-enter this deal, we are de-establishing the United States of America. We're making it extremely difficult for them to have trust, as they're constantly jumping between agreements. If you think of something, no one is going to trust you if you keep changing your mind. If you're too on what the right path is. But the US has chosen this path. It's decided not to be in this deal, and we've got to respect that. They've had reasons, they've done what has to be done, and now we've just got to wait and see what the final result is. Now, it's also important to note why. Why did the US leave this deal? Well, obviously there are multiple clear reasons why, but one prominent one was that Iran was not abiding by the agreement. Your Honor, there have been many rumors and there have been various incidents that have been reported where Iran has gone against this agreement. In the agreement, Iran was supposed to agree to denuclearize and stop further enrichment of uranium and destroy all uranium stockpiles it currently had. And in exchange for this, the countries would lift the sanctions that Iran has done. But they've gone against it. And this was one of the primary reasons why the US withdrew from the agreement. The US does not just decide to randomly withdraw from the agreement and sanction America. They're such a great country, that's not what they do. They have clear reasons, and if Iran has broken the trust, if Iran has done what they should not do, then that's why they've left. Iran was not denuclearizing, and they were not destroying the stockpiles of uranium. This agreement clearly stated that Iran should do this. And if they did, the countries would do their part of the agreement, but Iran did not. Now, what is the point of being in an agreement where the terms are not abided by? This is completely unjustified. And therefore, why should the US, the United States, stay in the agreement when Iran have clearly broken their part? Therefore, the US has a great reason to leave the agreement, as Iran have gone against it. Furthermore, why should the US go back in when Iran have lost their trust? If you were basically, with this motion, by re-implementing it, we're basically asking Iran to denuclearize. We're saying, okay, we're going to give you a second chance. You went against us first time, but we know you're not going to do it again. The truth is Iran is in the Middle East, and that region, there's a lot of fighting going on there right now. There's the Syria conflict. There are various terrorist organizations there right now. I'm not saying it's a bad region. All we're saying is that there are various conflicts going on there, and it may not be the best reason to put all our trust in. Therefore, these sanctions are restricting Iran. They may be stopping Iran from going into various wars. So they're extremely beneficial. And by taking them out for no valid reason, especially when Iran is going against the agreement and denuclearizing, is completely unwise. Therefore, we should not re-implement this, as the current system is working. And again, there's no guarantee that Iran is going to do this, as they already went against it the first time. Now, I'd like to quickly create a model. What would happen if this motion passes? Well, first of all, the US view would be untarnished. It would still be seen as one of the greatest nations in the world. Other nations would trust it, and they would always be free to jump into conflicts and help. Being a member of the Security Council, their voice would still be heard very well. Now, furthermore, also the Middle East would be a safer place, as we're sanctioning Iran and stopping various wars that might break out over there. So there are many reasons, and these are just a few that I'm listing. But what happens if this motion doesn't pass? Well, first of all, what happens if this motion does not pass, right? Iran would basically continue to nuclearize and go against the agreement, while the other countries would not know. Furthermore, the US view would be tarnished, and the US would be seen as a country which is two-minded and cannot decide on a view. I'd like to finally end with a personal story. I have made deals with people, but if they do not hold up their part, then why should I hold up mine? I did everything they wanted me to. I trusted them, and they trust me in return, and I have fulfilled their trust. But if they don't fulfill mine, why should I continue? Why should I go back and trust them again? Why should I make the same mistake twice? I will not do it. And therefore, in this exact same way, in a much larger context, this motion should stand. Thank you, and I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the fine speech. Now I would like to invite the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Great. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Give me a moment. I think enough is enough. I've had enough about OG being all about how the US is amazing. I'm going to quickly rip out of the debate first. But then secondly, I also think that enough is enough. That terrorism and all the things spurred on by US-Iran relations, because Donald Trump has uniquely pulled out of the JCPOA, is enough. We think that on side 00, we're going to give you a case why you're actually going to join the JCPOA. I'm going to give you substantive framing about how other nations are highly likely going to co op into this. I'm also going to talk about the impacts and our counterfactual in today's debate. Let's just quickly frame OG out of the debate. They said that basically four things. I'm going to rebut this with 4 layers. Firstly, like they basically think that it's Trump now, right? Like I think large parts of the argumentation could be applicable to like why Trump should pull out of the nuclear deal. That was like literally 2 years ago. Please live in the present. But secondly, they also said that many nations respected Trump pulling out. As I'll later frame into the debate, I'll just say that the JCPOA was largely effective. And as a brief point of refutation, many of the things that they talk about, maybe like enriching the nuclear stockpile, were actually a result of Trump pulling out, which actually makes them more reliant, actually make them more defensive in the first place. But thirdly, when they talk about how, you need to like uphold your trust and all that, we would like to say that the US itself, even before the JCPOA, has already broken its trust. Therefore, on a principle ground, therefore, in geopolitics, no one really has that big of an advantage. And that's to say, Trump's repeated basically sexual harassment allegations, his repulsion of the TVP of the US, which is probably the largest trading bloc in the entire world, back in the day, and also obviously the incitement of capital rise, right? Like if you want to talk about trust, talk about like how the entirety of the capital was under fire under Trump's administration. But fourthly, I would like to just talk about how this is not an after debate. It's just not about the US. I'm going to give you substantive framing about all powers in the world and how that actually fits into incentives and capacities, why something that's so good. Firstly, reframing in Iran and why this is something that's okay. We think that Iran has been struck by 3 major factors that it's more likely for them to actually re-engage and actually stick to their JCPOA, even in the worst case that they didn't really stick to it in the first place. Firstly, because Iran is actually highly reliant on oil because it basically contributes 80-90% of its GDP. We think that the COVID-19 crisis actually made it extremely hard to maintain a sustainable economy. That's to say, because of COVID-19, because of widespread justifications and all that, we think that Iran is actually in a quite weak position, both mentally, but in terms of health, in terms of economics and all that. But secondly, the recent Iranian protests around the entirety of Iran means that the government currently has to appear to more moderate, right? Literally because of the sanctions and all that, meaning that they were more likely to be starving on the streets and all that. We think that that's why Iran actually has a pretty large incentive for them to be more moderate in today's status quo. But thirdly, we think that sustainability of economy is something that's clearly important to today's debate. That's to say, because I've told you before how sanctions have basically screwed over Iran's economy to a very large extent, especially because Iran is quite reliant on these oil sanctions. We think that the general public itself has a pretty large bargaining chip against Iran. That's Iranian administration, meaning that it's especially because they don't want revolts, because they want their economy to be more sustainable in the future, because they want all that. We think that it's more likely that Iran will be more moderate to accept the JCPOA. But fourthly, even if they come up and talk about how, this is a form of new colonialism and stuff like that, we'd just like to say that the JCPOA was a multilateral agreement decided by power like China, but like Germany and France, which are like really not like maybe like Western nation that people would be like, oh, bowing down to. But let's talk about but the plan is uniquely something that's good and why we're more than proud to defend that. Firstly, Iran doesn't really, even in the worst case, they really don't have the capacity to reach like the say 80%, 90% threshold of actually enriching nuclear weapons. We think that like even in the worst case, they're around like 20%, which is okay for them to have nuclear energy to export nuclear exports and all that. But secondly, because of the sanctions and all that, we think that that's why, especially because the plan was working before, that's to say around like maybe let's say 2/3 of all the centrifuges were taken away. That's to say, even if you have some level of nuclear stockpile, we do think you need some sort of production that were critically taken away in the JCPOA, and we think this is something that's good. So in conclusion, why the JCPOA is something that's so good? Firstly, it's highly transparent, and it's actually very multilateral by many countries. It was actually succeeding to a very large extent. Don't let OG fool you. Secondly, there's a very large premise of international cooperation. And thirdly, it's quite linear and effective. Firstly, why would China be more than willing to step into this? We think that the one but one world diplomacy has really mean that, oh, they're more likely to opt into previously successful agreements. They don't want to be seen as like basically helping terrorists, which Iran might resort to under counterfactual. But we also think that other stakeholders like Germany and France were more than likely to opt in the JCPOA to implement it because of several reasons. Firstly, because of diplomatic ties, both of them want to like fight for like EU to basically want Europe to be more powerful in terms of diplomacy. But secondly, because both of them are facing like internal conflict. That's to say, Germany itself, because Merkel might be leaving, the other contenders might also be more moderate to basically say that, hey, like this deal was working before, let's stick to that. The same going to go through Macron, who is basically fighting against Le Pen into the status quo. Le Pen being a like very far-right radical individual, we think that Macron has all the incentives in today's society to basically go back to the plan and say that, hey, this is something that worked before, we're going to stick to our guns. Why is something that's good under our side of the house? Let's just briefly say why this is exclusive to our side of the house and why this is like the counterfactual is way worse. We think that because of Trump basically withdrawing from the JCPOA, like firstly, US-Iran relations are basically deteriorating at a very large rate, basically with threats of even having the draft to go to like war with Iran. But secondly, without peace and security in the Middle East, something that's really important because firstly, COVID-19, secondly, because of all the like the regional tensions and stuff like that, right? We think that belligerence on their side of the house is far more likely to happen because of several reasons to present to you. Firstly, because there really isn't like a substantive plan to stick to, because like it's incredibly like hard to actually assuage, to basically measure, to gauge like what people are at, right? It's far better to like go back to at least this plan. So we have like a template, so we have like a drafting board to see like what to improve on it. But we're more than happy to defend it as the original stats. But secondly, we also think that this stability is far more important because like this is something that's very international. That's to say, like something that international consensus is something that people are more than willing to opt into because it previously worked, there's previously something that's successful, you're more likely to like not lose your image like that. So what are the impacts of all of this? Firstly, you increase regional stability. That's to say, Iran really doesn't have that much incentive to like basically opt out of that because we think that Iran, as I've characterized you before, is quite weak. They're like don't really have the factor of reduction because their centrifuges are literally taken away by the UN in the JCPOA. That's to say, they firstly don't have the threats of actually having some like nuclear armament and all that. Secondly, they might also, because there isn't that much of a threat to them in the first place, because maybe you understand that the US is also quite weakened by COVID-19 and all that. That's to say, maybe they would like decrease the rate of terrorist groups in the region, basically decreasing all the tensions. And thirdly, maybe having less strikes in the Strait of Hormuz, am I correct? And all that. We think that they're more likely to basically tone down their rhetoric to a pretty large extent because they know that there's something that's finally reliable. Because Joe Biden has focused his campaign with lots of other international leaders to basically restore to like a post-Trump era, to restore to a point of moderation. My DL is going to talk about how this actually also good for the US if they want to talk about the US that much, how this lowers and assuages US internal tensions, but a majority proof you why this is something that's good, on how other nations are more than likely to opt into this and why the impacts are we're so willing to defend the impacts on our side of the house. Proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for the fine speech. Now let's invite the Deputy Prime Minister here.
All right, so I would like all POIs to be raised verbally, please. I may not see the chat throughout my speech. And I would like to start my speech in 3, to 1. So as a Deputy Prime Minister, I would like to start off by making some rebuttals to the case previously presented. Furthermore, I will be presenting my own model and my own framing for why we clearly win this debate, why my partner focused on the US and why it's really bad for his public image to be constantly jumping in and out of unreliable treaties. I'll be focusing more on Iran and why actually it is unsafe for us to re-enter this treaty. So what are some of the points previously made? Before we go on to that, I would like to point out that the leader of the opposition only talked about why sanctions are bad in general, and they didn't specifically relate it to Iran. So it is quite hard to tackle them on these points about sanctions because they didn't specifically say how the sanctions affect the economy or the political stability or whatnot. And so it's quite hard for us to weigh those. However, some more specific points that we were able to catch. They said that the US already broke trust before the JCPOA. And to quote them, enough is enough. They quoted this, and I would like to quote the exact same phrase, enough is enough. Since the US already broke some trust before, that is true, and because of that, it received public scrutiny. However, this would be one of the first cases of the US constantly jumping in and out. This happened in 2018. 2018, the US leaves. 2021, the US comes back. Then what happens? Does it leave again in 2024? So it creates this unreliable image, which my partner showed, and that's very bad for global politics. It's very bad for the US because they will be less trusted with treaties and less trusted with the ability to form proper solutions to these important matters. So clearly, my partner's case stands in this debate. Furthermore, they talked about how Iran relies on oil and COVID made it harder for them to have a strong economy. So it's hard for them to create nukes. That is true, but the chance of nuclear weapons creating nuclear weapons should be lowered as much as possible. And if we're going back into the treaty, we're strengthening their economy and we're giving them the economic funds and the money to potentially spend this. And then again, if we have a Republican leader in the US afterwards, then they may leave the treaty again. And then what do we end up with? We have a very strong Iranian economy, and now we don't have any sanctions on them. Furthermore, they argue that Iran does not have the capacity to create nuclear weapons. This is not true. For instance, they breached the contract, as my partner has stated. They had way too much uranium. They weren't supposed to have that. They were trying to hide that. There were also rumors about plans to create nuclear weapons. So clearly they do have the ability to do that. And lastly, they talked about how regional stability will be increased if countries go back. But how do they define regional stability? Because it's very hard for us to do that, to discuss that, because regional stability, we believe that they have a larger chance of creating nuclear weapons if we go back into the treaty. That is what my case will be about. And also Iran has quite a bit of corruption, so we don't get how this would lead to regional stability since they didn't define it for us, and it's a very abstract term. Now, onto my own case. By re-entering the Iran deal, the risk of Iran producing nuclear weapons will be higher than ever before, leading to an unsafe world for all. Your Honor, why did Trump leave the deal? He received public scrutiny for it, and he must have had reasons for that then. Well, actually, there was evidence and many claims that Iran broke the agreement and still planned on creating nuclear weapons. Some argue that they didn't actually start building them. Maybe opposition will want to point that out. However, we simply don't know. And also plans were definitely created for nuclear weapons, and uranium stock was measured in order to potentially have the future ability to create nuclear weapons. Furthermore, the original terms of the deal do not solve the issue of denuclearization of Iran. If it would, then Trump would have stayed in the deal. So clearly there's a huge problem with the deal because Trump risked a lot by leaving the deal when already he was not a favorable candidate for 2020. And yet he still did this, which he received some backlash for. Now, onto my own model. Well, what happens if if the US would re-enter the deal? Well, Iran's economy would blossom. And this is very one-sided, first of all, because the US does not need Iran. Quite frankly, it gets oil from other countries and gets all of its resources. So the US doesn't need to rely on it. And this debate is about whether the US and the Iran, whether the harms that this causes to their relationship and to their economies is more than the good. And clearly it is, because the US really gains nothing from entering this deal. Since the economy will be strong in Iran, it will blossom. Iran will have the money and the resources to create and plan to create nuclear bombs. They will most likely use nuclear bombs if they do create them, because the region is unstable. For instance, with Israel, they had a lot of conflicts, and we fear, quite frankly, as proposition, that if we give them more money by strengthening their economy and lifting all sanctions, they will have the ability to create nuclear weapons. Then they may be unstoppable. Yes.
Okay, if you're so sure that if America decides to pull out the Iran deal, and we're already because of that, Iranians are finally sure that they're going to start making more nuclear bombs, nuclear weapons, won't other countries be aware of this, and then it'll be easier to stop Iran from carrying it out? And wouldn't that result into another?
I understand. Yes, so we understand. Yes, so basically, yes, we know that Iran may have the ability to create nuclear weapons. However, if the US sticks with its stance to not re-enter the deal, then that clearly shows to all nations that probably there's something going on wrong there, since the US is a very globalized leading country in the world. So their impact, they have a huge impact on this conflict and on this treaty. Now, and why will this, going back to my case, and why will this create more weapons than in the status quo, that Iran's economy will blossom? Well, they will have money. Besides that, they will gain something very important: blind trust. The deal does not say that Iran will be searched for these weapons. They have a history of breaking treaties and betraying allies, so there's no justification that they will not try to create weapons. Clearly, the treaty is bad and ineffective. If the US enters it, then Iran will have a huge ability to create nuclear weapons, since they are blindly trusted by these P5 nations, and we cannot trust them with that. The effect of that is that there will be even more corruption, less stability, and more tension between countries like Israel and Iran, and there could be potentially a new world war or a nuclear war that will erupt. And so this is the case, that this is the world that opposition is trying to portray as good, and we quite frankly find that discerning. Furthermore, what about the status quo? What if we don't re-enter, the US doesn't re-enter? Well, Iran's economy will be restricted, and as the leader of the opposition excellently pointed out, their economy is quite weak right now, so they aren't probably able to create nuclear weapons. However, we want to keep it weak simply because it is a very unstable country, and because of corruption, some could argue that the money would be used to help like the actual people if we strengthen the economy, but that's not true, because Iran is corrupt. They would likely spend it on military campaigns and nuclear weapons and trying to attack Israel. So clearly, it's much harder to create nuclear weapons if we stay with the status quo, since they will have to spend the money on more basic necessities. Also, there will be much lower chance of potential wars and future conflicts. Iran could potentially start a conflict. They're very in the middle of doing those conflicts, and also there's a risk of terrorist groups taking over Iran, forming a coup or something like that, and that could really show that there could be future problems to the global prosperity and peace in the region, and those could be used for bad. So in my speech, I clearly talked about global peace, and the US has to stay out of this deal. Global peace is the main clash point of this debate. It is what has to be weighed, whether nuclear weapons can be made or not. The opposition did not even talk about the ability to make nuclear weapons, just about the sanctions. This debate is about the nuclear weapons. And clearly, in our side of the house, there's actually a much lower chance of nuclear weapons being created and future wars erupting because of the lack of funding. So please vote with us if you don't want World War III to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for the fine speech. Now, to wrap up the opening half of the debate, I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
I would like to ask if this volume is okay.
Yes, loud and clear.
Thanks so much. Okay. Okay, starting in 5, 4, 3, 2. Opening government cannot debate inside this debate if they do not know what's happening inside the nuclear deal, if they do not know the specific treaties of it, and they do not know what happened after Trump left the deal in 2018. One of the most significant uptakes in Iran trying to rearm its centrifuges was after Trump actually left the deal, because Iran thought Trump was literally shutting down the deal and therefore trust was breached. We think this is literally OG's own mechanism smacking themselves in the face. But when OG comes out and has the audacity to say that under this deal there'll be under no inspections, then just look at then OG's case doesn't even stand, because they don't even know what the deal is about. We think that Iran has already pledged to actually undergo constant surveillance and constant inspections over its nuclear centrifuges, where it was forced to keep its uranium stockpile at 3% instead of 80% for nuclear weapons. If OG doesn't know such facts, then they cannot exactly debate anyways. Cool. I'm going to do 3 things, right? Okay, first of all, a few pieces of rebuttal on, say, PM and DPM, a few pieces of extension on, say, how this benefits the US, also its regional allies, and finally a bit of weighing as a whole. Cool. So, first of all, PM comes out and says that, the US will try, so PM comes out and says that the image this presents is that the US will try to step into too much, and then therefore this is bad for the US because, they're being basically seen as very inconsistent and all of that stuff. Okay, first of all, we think that the international response when the US actually left the deal was something that was extremely deafening, right? The leaders of France and Germany, Macron and also Merkel, literally begged the US not to actually leave because there was no substantive impact and there was no substantive evidence that Iran was constantly violating the deal. On the counterfactual, what actually happened after the US actually left the deal was that besides maximum pressure trying to enforce on Iran was also at the same time trying to gain its centrifuges as well. Iran was at the same time trying to actually enrich its own uranium after the US has left the deal. We do not think that this is something that OG wants in any sort of way. Okay, the second thing they told us, no thank you, is that people have to respect the US stance. Look, I think my I think my L has already characterized this, but we're not living in 2018, we're living in 2021, and therefore Biden's a new president, and we think that even on a principle level, he has the right to choose whichever route his country is going to. We do not think this point actually stands as well. But one of the biggest points I actually bring out is that Iran could somehow cheat. Okay, first of all, we think that even if they cheat, we think that cheating and actually making a nuclear weapon are two separate things, right? You literally have to use uranium from like 3% to say 80%. We think that the process is something that's extremely arduous. The process is something that's extremely hard, especially under a country that has been sanctioned to literally death by like say oil sanctions and also like how its people are suffering. We think that even on a case where they try to talk about like say how Iran is violating the deal, we think that because of the original constraints that the deal actually puts on Iran, the things such as constant infections and the things such as how 2/3 of your uranium stockpile are actually taken away from you, but that these things make it impossible for Iran to actually get nuclear weapons anyway. We think that on counterfactual, this was also something that was characterized extremely clearly, where Iran was actually now trying to actually gain nukes when the US actually left the deal. We think this is even more contributing to those things such as destabilization, contributing to increased and aggravated tensions inside the region as a whole. Okay, the final thing they told us is that Iran will have the money and resources to somehow make this deal because like the world blindly trusts Iran for no reason. Cool. Okay, so the first thing is that literally all the analysis that we talked about the deal just now just comes in. We do not think this point actually weighs out. But the second thing here is that we do not think that blind trust is something that the US or any other country has in Iran anyways. We think that like each country has their own reason to be skeptical of Iran. We think that incentive analysis is this because Iran is inherently not exactly a democracy. We think that like such incentive structures will definitely still occur. We do not think that OG's point on here actually stands at all as well. Cool. So moving on to extensions, on how this actually benefits the US. I'm going to mainly talk about two things, on say how it actually benefits in terms of stability, and also how it actually benefits it in terms of say common regional tensions, all of that stuff. Cool. So first of all, talking about stability, we think that what's likely to happen is that it's going to be good for say the US public, because what happened after like Trump was left what happened after Trump left the deal was there was a huge ton of internal conflict inside the US on like say what to actually deal with it. But then that conflict was also aggravated by the American assassination of Qasem Soleimani in like January last year, right? We think that all of these things make the US public increasingly polarized against each other. We think that the change that has happened when this deal actually comes into play is now that the US now has a concrete input. Now the US has a concrete direction on say how to actually process and how to actually proceed with dealing with Iran. No, thank you. We think that this is something that's inherently good for the US people because it's inherently less polarized, inherently there's less deadlock as a whole. But why does this also benefit the US on an international scale? We think of what happened after Trump actually left the deal. A vacuum in terms of diplomacy inside the Middle East. Given that the US is such a superpower in this day and age, we think that if the US actually leaves the deal, it means that the US has literally no trust inside Iran whatsoever. This actually meant that Iran was more likely to actually gain nuclear weapons after the US actually left the deal. We think the change that we actually bring to you on side opening opposition is when the US comes back in and say that we're going to resort to diplomatic means of say discussing with you and say negotiating you like all the terms previously, then what's going to happen is that other countries will now see the US as finally the legitimate actor is back. Finally the peace broker is now going to be back. We think this is something that's also inherently beneficial towards the US, especially because how its reputation has been actually tarnished by say threatening to leave NATO and actually leaving the TPP. We said this is also something that benefits the US as a whole. But why does this also help calm like regional tensions inside, say, Iran and also the nuclear east, right? Like OG comes out and brings this weird point on, say, how Iran can actually get nukes and try to nuke Israel and all that stuff. Because notice that if this really has a chance of happening, then Iran will basically get nuked back because Israel also has nukes. We think that mutually assured destruction will basically happen in this case. But we think that the change under outside opening opposition that will give you is that we think that what's likely to happen is that more peace is likely to actually be aggravated, right? Especially because Iran has been so tarnished by such sanctions, especially because Iran has been so devastated by things such as COVID-19 and how it's like unable to actually export oil to other countries. We think Iran's more likely to actually negotiate with its partners and negotiate with its like friends and like not exactly friends but like neighbors and also actually achieve peaceful situations, right? We think this will have three unique impacts. First of all, is we think that the Iranian people will actually be happier because sanctions are lifted. Second, we think that tensions are less likely to be aggravated when things like Israel and also Israel and US have less reasons to actually criticize Iran. We think Iran also actually benefits. But the final thing here is that we think the US also benefits as a peace broker, as a negotiator inside this conflict. We think in terms of magnitude, in terms of probability, this is something that's much likely to happen, because if you extend an olive breach to Iran, then Iran's likely to actually get it because they're suffering as a whole. We think in terms of magnitude, we think that if we benefit both the Iranian people and US diplomacy, this is also something that we uniquely way over opening government. We have never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for the fine speech. Now, to start the closing half of the debate, I would like to invite the Member of Government here.
Right, just a moment. Right, so firstly, I'd like to say that if anyone has any POIs, please say them verbally rather than via chat. So I'll just be starting the timer. Okay, all right. 3, 2, 1, go. Under the JCPOA, Iran had agreed to certain stipulations to control its nuclear power in exchange for the lifting of various multilateral sanctions placed on it by several nations that had severely hurt Iran's economy. However, due to its blatant disregard of these terms and the breaking of trust, the United States had pulled out of its deal. And considering that it is such a major superpower, we know that it had reasons, and we will be delving into these later on. So, greetings, panel and fellow debaters. We here at Team Closing Government strongly believe that the US made the right decision and that this re-implementation would be detrimental not only for the US but for world peace and world safety. So the main reason that they pulled out was due to the regime's destabilizing activity and support for terrorist proxies in the region, and hence they had placed additional sanctions on the regime to block their financing of terror, which we will get into, which I will get into later on. First, to rebuttal some of what was said by the opposition. Specifically, the leader of opposition had said that Iran would not be able to reach an 80-90% level, and that only a small amount of nuclear weapons or they would only be able to have a small amount of nuclear power. However, under the JCPOA, under the nuclear deal, if we were to re-enter the deal and remove these sanctions, then Iran's economy would flourish, and this would and then this would lead to the funding of terror, which we will be getting into in the future. They'd also mentioned US and Iran relations deteriorating as a result of this deal. However, that has already been happening in the past due to various actions that Iran has committed, and due to their blatant disregard for other deals as well. Next, the deputy leader of opposition had mentioned that the United States that since the United States has no trust, Iran is most likely to gain weapons back after they left the deal. However, Iran has already flouted the terms of the deal in the past, even when the US was in the deal, and they'd broken the terms of the deal, they'd broken their trust, and we can't say that, hey, even though you've already done it once, we're still going to give you a second chance anyways, just because there is the pressure of public opinion on Biden. We can't just do that, since it would not make any sense. They'd also mentioned about Iran suffering. Well, to that we say that Iran is already trying to create nuclear weapons, not only for peace but to advance their own purpose. And they've also committed various other atrocities against their own people. Hence, their point just doesn't make sense. Next, moving on to some of my substantives. So while we believe that the opening government made some great points, we don't think that they truly saw into the core of what is being debated, which is Iran's support of terrorist actions and how that poses a threat to world peace itself. So moving into my points, Iran's support of terrorist actions is something that should be given cardinal importance in this debate, since Iran wants a nuclear deal, as their country has sanctions against it. So it's very poor. And once it's lifted, it'll be richer by selling its oil to the EU and other nations. And this would then increase its economy, make it better. But then this could lead to them supporting terrorist organizations like the Hezbollah by funding them. And the thing is that these US sanctions, when they were imposed by President Donald Trump, they were hitting Hezbollah hard where it hurts. So these raising tensions with Tehran had reached a crescendo in those days, and Iran's ability to finance allies such as the Hezbollah had been curtailed. So Hezbollah, which is the best funded and the most senior of Tehran's proxies, had seen a sharp fall in its revenue and was forced to make draconian cuts to its spending, which is contributing towards peace, which is actually contributing towards peace in the region. Moving on to my second point, which is that this deal had only provided a short-term solution to a long-term problem. The initial framework that the United States had proposed for the nuclear Iran deal was 20 years. So most of the accord's primary terms would sunset in about 10 years at most. And once this agreement expires, Iran would have the capacity to become a significant military and industrial power. There are more than 80 million people who live in the country that there are more than 80 million people who live in the country that would see more allied involvement in their affairs instead of less, which would likely create a push toward long-term imperialism. Building on this point is my next one, is that it would not... no, thank you. Moving on to my next point is that this deal would not stop Iran from becoming a nuclear state in the future. As critics of this deal have been concerned about the fact that this accord still allows the country to establish a robust nuclear infrastructure, which is not what we want, as we want to preserve world peace. So as we'd mentioned before, this deal would only prevent the development of warheads and the enrichment of uranium for only a decade. This is a very short time period, and they could just go ahead and start making them after this time period. And also, this is in a perfect world. No, thank you. This is in a perfect world. They could still they could still continue the development of warheads and enrichment of uranium, and with no guarantees that another accord could be moving on to my next point is that, as was mentioned before, Iran did not uphold the deal before, and so there is no proof that they'll uphold it now. An IAEA report from before has shown that Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium has increased by about 12 times the amount that is allowed under the JCPOA while mining uranium. And in addition to that, they're also testing nuclear missiles to carry weapons. So considering that Iran is still continuing to do these heinous actions, even under the JCPOA, we really do not see how it would be beneficial to re-enter the JCPOA, since they've already flouted the terms of it in the past, and it has proven to be ineffective, since ultimately it is a very faulty deal in itself, as it was not proven to be effective in the past. Over here I have proven to you that through this, Iran's actions have clearly shown that it cannot be trusted or given second chances, since they would continue doing what they have done in the past. And through this, we have shown why exactly our side is favorable in this debate, and we are proud to be representing this side. Thank you.
Thank you, Member of Government. Now let's continue with Member of Opposition. Here.
Hello, may I have a few minutes to prepare my speech?
Sure, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. My speech will start now in 3, 2, 1. Now, this House believes that the implementation of the Iran deal with the original terms unchanged, of course, will only bring more good compared to harm, because what the opposition team actually want to do is want to get back into the Iran deal, meaning Iran will actually stop all nuclear technology that will get their sanction lifted. The aim of what we want actually is to keep both countries safe, as well as keeping the diplomatic business running. If US keeps out of this deal, they will actually have zero control of what Iran wants to do. But we must keep in mind that the stakeholder within this type of situations will, of course, not be the US, the Iran, and the people of Iran as well. Because if we do not get back into the deal, there will no longer be a possible business transaction to continue its economical cycle, as well as improve the living conditions of the people, making it fairly difficult for its citizens in Iran to actually obtain job opportunities to support their families as well. As we all know, the war is what causes the loss of millions of dollars from both countries involved, of course. Now, why the US actually opt out of the Iranian deal? Trump becoming president, saying that the deal wouldn't last long anyway. Since then, Iran has actually suffered economically because they weren't able to carry out trades. Trump's decision has actually been highly controversial, especially given that three of America's very top allies, France, Germany, and the UK, were strongly opposed to this move. Now, when we say they comply, yes, Iran did actually agree not to produce either the highly enriched uranium or the plutonium that could be used in nuclear weaponizing. It also took steps to ensure that the facility pursued only civilian work, including medical and industrial research that can be highly impactful to the lives of the citizens, allowing them to have access in multiple career fields, improving the lives of living standards of the people by providing them through the development and advancement of technology, of course. The agreement has been said to be gone smoothly, starting that Iran has met the preliminary pledges, and the United Nations responded by repealing their sanction, of course. President Barack Obama's administration had actually dropped several secondary sanctions on the oil sector, which actually allowed Iran to ramp up its oil export to nearly levels it was prior to sanctions. The United States and many European nations were actually able to unfroze about 100 billion worth of frozen Iranian assets. However, after opting out of the deal, it nearly collapsed since President Trump withdrew the United States from it in 2018 and reinstated devastating banking and oil sanctions, saying that the agreement has failed to address Iran's ballistic missile program and its proxy warfare in the region, and that he claims that the sunset provisions will actually enable Iran to pursue nuclear weapons in the future. The people who supported Iran, such as China, is already against US as well, keep in mind. Now, by doing so, when you say the deal will only provide a short-term solution to a long-term problem once the agreements expire, and Iranian can actually be developing a strong military power, obviously the solution is simple. We can always just renew the Iranian deal to stop this from happening. The 5 countries will just sanction Iran again, and Iran will have no choice but to go back into the deal. This difference between the US pulling out of the deal versus all 5 countries pulling out of the deal at the same time. If the US pulls out, it was actually a small equivalent to a small paper cut. All 5 countries pulling out does really hurt the Iranian status and will actually want to go back to collect on the deal. US by pulling out so will actually just enables Iran to go back to making the nuclear war. No, thank you for the PRI. Because as we already know, the Iranian does not care about its citizens if they opt back to development of nuclear weapons. Thus, if the economic sanctions only affects the citizens first, the Iranian would not care and will resort back to working closer with China, as their system that they have been working on has actually been highly corrupted. They may have seen that Iran has actually posed as a possible threat about the nuclear warheads, posing in a highly possibility of possible future nuclear war being weaponized and used against multiple countries, especially the US. Yet, we must understand, let's take a look back. A war general was executed last year, which increases the possibility of us getting nuked. So the general, going by the name of Soleimani's killing, actually sharply escalated the tension between the US and Iran, which causes the Iranian leaders to actually vow revenge, while the US officials actually said they will be taking preemptive attacks on any Iranian-backed paramilitary groups in Iraq that they perceive as a threat. Many in the international community actually reacted with concern and issues the statements of or declaration urgency against the restraint and diplomacies, of course. Now, this is all well known that Trump is known to make decisions based for his own interests. He has also a large hate towards Obama and have pulled out of many of Obama's schemes, such as the Obamacare and the Iranian deal. The Obamacare has actually caused many people in the poverty to not be able to get free healthcare, and he only pulled out of the Iranian deals because of the rumors and suspicions. Countries such as France, Germany, and UK was against US pulling out of the deal, thus these countries' trusts have been broken. Keep in mind that China and US are already at each other's already at each other's throats at the moment. President Trump's racism against them were only because of the COVID-19 problem, and slandering China has hurted their reputation as well. This will obviously make China want to go against America and support Iran in this case. The reason why China isn't doing anything right now is because being in the Iranian deal, US has the support of other 4 countries, so that is way too risky. But if they continue to remain out of the deal, we will only be angering all other 4 countries, and it will be easier for them to go ahead and support China, in return Iran as well. The economic sanction has actually been imposed from only one country, US, and it's not going to affect Iran since they are ruled by a corrupted leader who only care for themselves. The only people in the sanction are going to really affect the people on the ground, who are the civilians and citizens of Iran. And Iranian government doesn't really care about them because they're still living in the comfortable life. The US pulling out of the Iranian deal because they have so much faith in America himself just to plant an atomic bomb on Iran. China and other countries will also turn against US as they do not care about the people. To reiterate your point, of course, when you say can Iran keep enriching uranium? Yes, it can produce a small stock of uranium enriching at low levels, but not suitable for a bomb without future processing. The limit has lasted, of course, 15 years. And for that, I have never been prouder to oppose to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Member of Opposition, for the fine speech. Now to wrap up the case from the government bench, I'd like to invite the government whip here.
Can I have 30 seconds to get my rebuttals in order?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Right, so I'll start. Also, I would like my POIs to be questioned orally. So just unmute your mic and just say POI instead of typing it down in the chat. All right, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Greetings, respected adjudicator, worthy opponents, and fellow teammates. I'm speaker number 4 from Team Proposition, the government whip. And for today's speech, I'll be giving out my rebuttals, points of clash, and summarizing why exactly we have won this debate. Coming on to my rebuttals. First speaker of Team Opposition spoke how Iran can't reach the threshold for nuclear weapons. Do keep in mind that this fact, or rather statistic, has been taken when Iran doesn't have its economy back to its full thing. The moment all of these sanctions are taken back by the US, Iran's economy will start to prosper. The moment Iran's economy will start to prosper, Iran will start spending money, start spending time, efforts, resources into trying to build up its nuclear power. So it does indeed have the capacity to reach the threshold for the nuclear weapons, which is exactly why the P5 nations first decided in the first place to lift these sanctions in exchange for not allowing the nuclear weapons to be continuing being developed. Now, speaker number 1 also talked about how sanctions are bad, but speaker number 1 never really mentioned how are they bad related to the country of Iran as a whole, which I felt was lacking somehow. And I would like to provide rather the relation between the two. The USA only puts the sanctions back on Iran because of the IAEA. The IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a subsidiary of the UN. And the IAEA caught Iran operating an advanced I believe, 5 nuclear centrifuge, despite their obligations to do directly the opposite back in 2018. And Iran has already broken the trust of the P5 nations once, and I'm pretty sure there are numerous more reports by the UN, at least 2 more, on why exactly Iran broke the trust and how it broke it. Therefore, USA felt it being their obligation that they should back out of the deal right now to prevent Iran from, to put sanctions on Iran, number one, and to prevent Iran from making or developing any more nuclear weapons. Then coming on to speaker number 2 of team opposition. Speaker number 2 of team opposition spoke about how, again, Iran won't be able to make nukes. Like I've just rebutted it before, this statistic is taken keeping in mind the current economy of Iran, which is even lower since, or rather due to the COVID-19 situation. However, the moment all these sanctions are lifted, Iran's economy will be back in full swing, and they shall be spending their time, money, and efforts to building their nuclear weapons. Speaker number 2 also talked about how USA will lose their face. What I want to point out here is what would you rather have? Would you rather have USA losing their face, or would you rather have millions and millions of lives going out, just snuffing out, because USA wanted to save face, therefore USA should go back? That doesn't really make sense. Looking at it logically, USA should not bother to save face. Rather, USA should back out as soon as possible, and in fact, even convince other countries to back out and put sanctions back on Iran. Now, coming on to the third speaker for team opposition. Speaker number 3 of team opposition, in the first 2 minutes of that speech, they spoke about how an improved living condition for Iran will ensure that people can get their jobs easily. It shall ensure that the Iran's economy is back online. And then coming on to the very final sentences of the third speaker, they go on to mention how Iran doesn't really care about the citizens, and they will go back to developing their nuclear weapons. And this is a direct contradiction made in their own speech. Number 2, they talked about how China is supporting Iran. What I want to point out here is the fact that China is always against USA. The only reason, and I mentioned the only reason China is supporting Iran right now is in hopes that if they support Iran right now, Iran might want to return the favor, and China will have another nuclear ally with them, which could potentially strengthen their position against the US. That is the single, sole, and only reason China is supporting the Iran right now. Speaker number 3 also gave us an extremely good solution, if I may mention. Speaker number 3 spoke about how if Iran breaks the deal again in any simple way, then let all the P5 nations come and sanction them. What I want to point out is Iran has broken the deal before. Therefore, using the same logic of speaker number 3 from team opposition, the P5 nations should in fact replace sanctions back on Iran. Then I am also going to talk about how speaker number 3 told that Trump only backed out of the deal because of certain rumors that were circulating. Do keep in mind, these were not rumors. These were dedicated reports that were taken by the IAEA, which is a neutralized agency by the UN, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And it was proved that Iran was testing missiles to carry nuclear warheads. And number 2, it was proved that Iran was mining uranium in their own country. Now, speaker number 3 also talked about how all the 4 countries will support China because USA has kept backing out of the deal, going back in, and so on. And this will anger the 4 nations against the USA. This won't happen after just a single issue. Their ties run much, their bonds run much more deeply than just one single event spoiling their whole relationship with each other. Now, I'd like to start off with summarizing my team's points. The first speaker of team government, the Prime Minister, spoke how USA will indeed get a bad picture if it jumps in deals and out of deals. So it really doesn't. So if we were to look at the necessary good, the greater good, and the easiest way to ensure that nobody dies in the best solution, the easiest way would be to ensure that USA does not get back into the Iran deal, into the Iran nuclear deal after when he is president, when Biden is president. Speaker number 1 also talked about how Middle East will be a safer place. And this is an absolutely brilliant point that is also denoted by speaker number 3, because Iran and Israel have had heavy tensions since day one. Since the time Israel has been made, Iran has always had heavy tensions with Israel. The moment Iran can get to know that they do indeed have nuclear weapons, Iran's first course of action will be trying to terrorize these Israeli people. Speaker number 2 talked about how there's a risk of Iran producing nuclear weapons. And this is, again, indeed true because Iran has broken their agreement before. There is nothing at all stopping them from doing it again. Speaker number 2 also talked about how if all these sanctions are replaced again, Iran's economy will blossom. This will lead to their leaders trying to make nuclear weapons, which will lead to war, which is not something that any of us want. Now, coming on to speaker number 3's point. Speaker number 3 talked about how after sanctions, Iran will indeed become richer and how it will support terrorist organizations such as the Hezbollah. This has been proven before. Back in 2017, it was shown by US spies that Iran was sending $200 million to the Hezbollah for their weapons and guns and whatnot. Iran didn't uphold. Speaker number 3 also talked about how Iran didn't uphold the deal before. We have no proof of how it will do again. Israel could be attacked, and this is a heavy possibility for the USA. And since Israel and USA are indeed the best of friends and in the politics itself, USA won't take such a risk. And do keep in mind something that speaker number 3 explicitly mentioned from my team was the fact that this treaty is only slowing Iran's nuclearization. It's not stopping it completely. All of the points that are up there will in fact stop after a certain 10 years, or the resolution that's been made is going to stop after 10 years that the UN has done. And the resolution will be null and void by the end of 10 years, and they will have to form a whole new resolution after 10 years, which we have no confirmation whether Iran will sign it or not. For all of these reasons, I beg you to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Government Whip, for that fine speech. Now, to wrap up the case from the opposition bench, I would like to invite the opposition whip here.
All right, give me a second to set up my timer. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to start with rebuttals to side closing government and first of all, let me explain what they had said just now earlier. Okay, they said that the reason why we shouldn't be trusting Iran anymore, and we shouldn't ask America to get back into this Iranian deal, is because Iran has broken the deal before, and also the IAEA has apparently reported that there are clear signs that Iran is continuously using uranium to develop nuclear weapons. If that was so true, if the IAEA really sensed that, which in fact they not, if you really think about it, because if they had sensed some nuclear activity happening in Iran, wouldn't they have informed wouldn't they have informed the other 5 countries as well, France, Germany, China, UK, and yeah, because if that was in fact a fact, then wouldn't the other countries also be concerned as well, and wouldn't they want to opt out of the Iranian deal as well? So I don't believe that fact is the thing that you claim as a fact is true, because other countries were very heavily opposed to America pulling out the Iranian deal, because all Trump said when he wanted to pull out the deal was that there were rumors circulating around the fact that Iran was continuing nuclear activity, right? Second of all, I want to talk about Trump, right? We've got to look at this thing, because side government keeps wanting to emphasize the fact that, oh, America is such a superpower. They probably did what's best. They made the right decision to pull out the Iranian deal. Back then, the person who pulled out the Iranian deal was President Trump. This guy is racist. This guy, all he wants and cares about is his power and his business. In fact, in 2019 and 2020, there's been multiple incidents where Trump has actually chosen to attack Iran, even though Iran was doing absolutely nothing. He just chose to attack Iran because of his suspicions, etc. Right? And Trump, we also got to realize that Trump is also he has such a deep hatred for Obama, and thus that also gives another incentive for Trump to want to pull out the Iranian deal, because back then it was Obama who had helped to get the countries to be with the Iranian deal, and sorry, no PI yet. Right. So next of all, I want to talk about why it is so harmful that America, why it does more good for America to join back in this nuclear deal than it does any harm, right? Because you got to realize, and what my first speaker has already talked about, was the fact that one country pulling out of this, imposing sanctions on Iran is not as damaging as 5 countries putting sanctions on Iran. Because realize that Iran is a corrupt country. I'm pretty sure every team in this debate round has agreed with that. They don't care about the citizens. That's why there's so many human rights issues in Iran as right now. So if the America is going to cause sanctions on Iran, even though America may be one of Iran's big traders, Iran still has the support of the 4 other countries who did not support America pulling out of the Iranian deal. All that's going to happen is that America's sanctions is just going to affect the people on the ground, the people who Iran doesn't even care about, and it's not going to stop Iran from wanting to continue, from deciding to go against the US, partnering up with countries like China, who's also against the US, and they both share a common partner in order to come up with ways to get back at the US. And before I continue, sure, I'll take up a POI.
Right. We just like to ask why exactly you mentioned the point about other countries not caring that Iran had broken the terms of the deal, considering that Britain, France, and Germany had planned to introduce a resolution at the IAEA Board of Governors criticizing Iran for limiting the agency's inspections and for breaking the deal, meaning that they clearly knew about it and that you should probably check your facts.
All right, fine. All right, let's say Iran did break the deal at the start, right? And all these countries are also really concerned about this. Then they went back, okay, fine. Say they did go to the IAEA to reach a discussion, but in the end, they end up not to put anything against Iran, decide not to do anything against Iran's deal. I can't think of any reason. And I don't think side government has given us any reason as to why these countries would have still found out about Iran's secret activities of continuing to produce uranium nuclear bombs and still choose to go with the Iranian deal, even though they know it's already risky and very dangerous, right? Side government never gave us any reason as to why that happens. All side government says, and this is why all side opening government has talked about is, if America just remains out the Iranian deal, then all the other countries are going to trust America because now they seem more consistent and like they're not going in and out. But the fact that the president that went out of the Iranian deal was Trump, who also decided to opt out of WHO just because he decided that he wanted to be racist and that he didn't like China anymore and that the COVID is all China's fault, endangering the lives of so many American citizens. The fact that the President Trump is already doing this, as well as vividly displaying how much discrimination and racism and his irrationality because of his thirst for power, I don't think that other countries would still want to put faith in America anyways. And I think by getting Biden to correct this mistake, by allowing America to get back into the Iranian deal, that's what is going to put more faith into America, because now other countries believe that, oh, look, America is doing the right thing and they're being supportive of us, right? Because side government also never gave us an alternative. Because say if America does pull out of this deal and sanctions are just going to happen, literally nothing is going to happen. Iran's tension with US is just going to escalate, and people are going to be angry at America, angry at Iran, and there's a way higher risk of people attacking each other, right? And also the fact that side government constantly tries to emphasize on the fact that by not lifting these economic sanctions, by giving Iran the money, etc., there's a higher chance of Iran using this money to produce nuclear bombs and nuclear weapons, and because now they have a good economy, right? We believe that that's not true, because the minute that there's an actual confirmation that Iran is doing these kinds of activities, then all the countries will decide to go up against Iran, and Iran won't be a match for that because Iran is just such a small country. We got to understand that. And on side closing opposition, what we believe is that the only way for us to protect the world peace and world safety is if America gets back into this deal, so that at least there is an assurance and that at least there is a concrete step, a concrete action that's being taken in order to prevent Iran, in order to gain as much help from other countries so that they won't be able to attack them. And with that, I've never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you, opposition. With that, we've ended the debate. You may virtually cross the floor and shake hands. You may leave this breakout room and we will deliver the result later. So thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Virtual shake hands, guys.
Thank you for having us.